This is the first video in a series I'm planning on Darwinism, specifically why I am not a Darwinist. Of course, when I say that, I have to immediately add that this does not mean I don't believe in evolution, because evolution and Darwinism are not the same thing. Certain aspects of evolution are trivial to demonstrate, and Darwinists use those to artificially prop up their theory, and that's what this particular video is going to look at. For those wondering what my own view is, that will be in a future video. So let me start by examining the one thing that Darwinists can actually point to as a success in their theory: natural selection. The problem with natural selection is not that it is false. The problem is actually that it is true. It's true no matter what. It is, in fact, impossible to falsify. And while that at first seems to be a good thing for the theory, logicians know that something that is true no matter what, that is impossible to falsify, that's a tautology. And in terms of evidence, it is next to worthless. To demonstrate why this happens in natural selection, let me first tell you a story. It's an anecdote. About 10 or 15 years ago, I went with my cousin to the Denver the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. It's rather easy to get that confused given the content that's inside that building. But anyway, on that particular day, my cousin and I saw a touchscreen kiosk that was there presenting a game that it was supposed to prove natural selection. When you started the game, there would be dozens of moths just flying around the screen. They went dark gray to light gray, and it was on a black background, and they flew around at various speeds. So there were slow moths and fast moths. And the object of the game was that you would touch a moth. That would count as a predator eating the moth. And when you killed off half the population, the remaining half would pair up apparently at random and produce offspring. And the offspring would have the averages of the parental values for the color and speed. Now, quite clearly, my cousin and I saw that what the game was attempting to show was that since it was easier to catch the slow light-colored moths, then you would be more likely to kill the slow light-colored moths. After a few generations, they'd go extinct, and by the end you'd have a screen of fast, dark-colored moths flitting about. We specifically targeted the fastest and the hardest to see moths until, by the end of our game, the screen was filled with slow-moving, light-colored moths. I remember going away at the time thinking, well, so much for natural selection. Only to realize later that evening as we were going home that, no, I'd actually demonstrated natural selection after all. See, the typical environment being simulated in the game was one that was detrimental to the survival of the slow light-colored moths. But my cousin and I had only changed the environment. It was now detrimental to fast, dark-colored moths. The end results were still natural selection. It's only the environment that changed. And that's when I realized that no matter what the final population was on the last screen, you could still say that came about due to natural selection. Even if you randomly picked a moth, that just meant that the population was built off randomness. And that immediately became a problem, because if the result is due to natural selection no matter what, how would it ever be possible to falsify natural selection? This is a problem at the heart of natural selection. It is a little easier to see when we look at the synonymous term survival of the fittest. Now, Darwin did not invent the phrase survival of the fittest, and that was actually Herbert Spencer. But Darwin liked it enough that he added it to later editions of his book on the origin of species, and he used it as a synonym. When examining the phrase survival of the fittest, our first question should be, what is meant by survival? It's naive to think that it means an individual organism survives. That's not what survival means in Darwinism. Survival in Darwinism means reproduction. If someone lives 1 billion years but cannot pass on his or her DNA, then that's useless in Darwinism. On the other hand, if you live 15 minutes but produce a new generation, then your species has survived. So survival is reproduction. That is the key. If that is what survival means, what does fittest mean? Again, fitness is not talking about the person who's most able to run a marathon or the strongest or the most agile. Fitness refers only to reproductive fitness. You can be the strongest man ever, but if you're impotent, your genes do not get passed on to the next generation. You can be the fastest woman, but if you're impotent, the same problem results. So fitness refers to reproductive fitness. Now, put that together. Survival of the fittest literally means those who reproduce the most are those who reproduce the most. Clearly that is true, but equally clearly it's trivial. And it's certainly irrelevant to proving Darwinism because it's a straight up tautology. Some Darwinists have recognized that the way natural selection is used can be a problem. Stephen Jay Gould, for example, said, arguments that propose adaptive superiority as the basis for survival risk the classic error of circular reasoning. Survival is the phenomenon to be explained, not the proof ipso facto that those who survived were better adapted than those who died. This issue has been kicking around the courtyards of Darwinian theory for more than a century. It even has a name, the tautology argument. Critics claim that our motto, survival of the fittest, is a meaningless tautology because fitness is defined by survival, and the definition of natural selection reduces to an empty survival of those who survive. The great irony of this is that Gould goes on to say, creationists have been known to trot out this argument as a supposed disproof of evolution, as if more than a century of data could come crashing down through a schoolboy error in syllogistic logic. In fact, the supposed problem has an easy resolution, one that Darwin himself recognized and presented. Fitness, in this context, superior adaptation, cannot be defined after the fact by survival, but must be predictable before the challenge by an analysis of form, physiology, or behavior. So note that. He is saying that you can predict what will happen based on an analysis of form, physiology, or behavior. And that's all great and good, except that almost 50 pages earlier, Gould said, I challenge any paleontologist to argue that he could have gone back to the Burgess Seas and, without the benefit of hindsight, picked out which species would survive and which would die. Wind back the tape of life and let it play again. Would the replay ever yield anything like the history that we know? Gould also said, groups may prevail or die for reasons that bear no relationship to the Darwinian basis of success in normal times. Even if fishes hone their adaptations to peaks of aquatic perfection, they will all die if the ponds dry up. But grubby old Buster the lungfish and his kin may prevail because a feature evolved long ago for a different use has fortuitously permitted survival during a sudden and unpredictable change in rules. And if we are Buster's legacy and the result of thousands of other similarly happy accidents, how can we possibly view our mentality as inevitable or even probable? And this conclusion Gould makes is far from alone. David M. Raup in his book Extinction said, sadly, the only evidence we have for the inferiority of victims of extinction is the fact of their extinction, a circular argument. And those words, a circular argument, are his words. In fact, he would later write, the fossil record documents extinctions of many species that were doing fine until their demise. And this highlights the problem. Understanding natural selection cannot help you to know in advance who will live and who will die as a species. Natural selection simply doesn't offer you any of that. Like with the moths in the simulation, the outcome of the species depends not on natural selection that is happening, but 100% on the environment. I simulated the environment in the game. In order to predict which moths would make it to the end, you'd have to know what I would do. Natural selection remained consistent throughout. It merely says that whatever I would do would result in a population based on my actions. This is also the case in the natural world. We do not know if a specific pride of lions will survive or not, because we do not know if the grassland is going to be affected by a drought or not, or whether a meteor will land right on top of them and wipe out the entire Serengeti. Sure, we can say that whatever the environment throws at the lions is going to determine whether or not they will live or die, but we cannot predict which one it will be. And that brings me to some of the arguments that are used to supposedly patch the tautology in natural selection. For example, a Darwinist once said to me that you could falsify natural selection by showing a hominid fossil intermixed with trilobite fossils. But that would actually falsify evolution itself, not natural selection. Clearly, this individual was confusing those two, which is a tactic that I lay squarely at the feet of Darwinists, because they seek to cause that very confusion. So here's the upshot. Natural selection does not predict which species will live or die. We can only say after the fact that since this species survived, it did so because of natural selection. That is true no matter what your view is. You can be a 6-day young Earth creationist and still hold to that definition of natural selection. Now let me be as clear as I can here. What I've said so far does not disprove Darwinism. It merely says that the evidence for natural selection being true is insufficient to say that Darwinism is true. Yet that is the primary evidence that is offered for why we should accept Darwinism. So at this point, we can merely say that Darwinism is unproven based on natural selection. The reasons that I specifically reject Darwinism itself will be in my next video.